Welcome to the Biltmore Church Podcast. Our church exists to glorify God by making disciples of Jesus who reach up, reach in, and reach out. And this podcast is a resource that's hopefully going to help you do just that. Today is our season 4 finale. We have cranked out. This is our 17th episode of this season. It flies by. Yeah. Isn't that crazy?
It is crazy.
Flies by.
And you've gotten the introduction down now.
Hopefully by now. However many hundred times.
I was giving you the side eye.
Just try to look straight ahead.
I can tell.
So, quick introductions. My name is Christian. I serve on staff here, and I'm here today with our lead pastor, Bruce Frank. Also, Michelle Myers, who is our women's discipleship coordinator. And we are continuing our One at a Time teaching series where we've been looking at the Gospels and how Jesus, throughout the Gospels, he ministers to the crowds, but often he zooms in and he focuses in on the individual, on the one. And we're kind of going through those passages of the Bible over the next several weeks as a church. And today we're going to rewind a couple weeks ago because we didn't get to have a conversation on this week where you preached, Pastor Bruce, you preached John chapter 4, which has a lot to do with miracles and healing and faith and prayer. Right. There's a lot there. We wanted to be able to go back and have a conversation about that because there's so much in there and there's so many questions that sort of get answered or at least brought up in that passage. So right off the top, just want to ask, when it comes to a passage like John 4, and really as you read the Gospels throughout, we were just talking a minute ago before we were recording about the amount of miracles that you see in the Gospels.
How many miracles would there be in the Gospels?
I now know the answer to this is 37.
Yep. I know that. Take one or two.
I know that because you told me right before we did this.
That's good. That's good. Okay.
I'm going to try to remember that.
Okay.
So first question, I guess, to ask after reading through a passage like John 4 is, hey, does God still do miracles? That's a frequent question. How would you answer that?
Yeah, and even before that, since we're going back 2 weeks, I mean, that those services that day were, probably top 10. I mean, I've been here 15 years, but that was a top 10 just sense of, and you never know what to expect. Sometimes you can't manufacture it, but I mean, God showed up and people have some stuff and the response time was, again, we kind of went out on a limb, but again, our people are so, in so many ways, their authenticity is very, I guess, just I'm proud of them for being authentic. I mean, church is a place you can fake really, really often, but our people, they're always been like that. There's 100 things I love about our church, but their authenticity is one of them as well, and vulnerability a little bit. It takes a lot, to us. Like I got some stuff, and there was some stuff. I mean, now we're 2 weeks out here in some of the reports, and nobody held back. And but I would say when it comes to miracles in general or healing, which is this one, typically the church kind of can fall into two ditches, I would say. On one hand, you got the ones that are like, God heals every time on my time. It's almost like wildfire, and almost like it's in some ways it even bleeds into the prosperity gospel. It's like, if I just get to X level faith, then God will answer this every time when I ask. And and if He doesn't, then it's my faith that doesn't have enough. And on the other hand, and I think some ways in a response to the wildfire, sometimes people are very content with no fire. And it's like, well, it's almost like, well, the Holy Spirit has an expiration date and God doesn't do miracles anymore. And that's a sad place as well. Yeah. And so I think in there it's like, God does do miracles. God does heal people. But also over that is the sovereignty of God. He doesn't. I mean, even in the Gospels, Jesus doesn't heal every single person that He sees. I mean, He heals a lot, as we talked about. 37. When you think about 3.5 years of ministry, John's Gospel tells us at the end, there's stuff that if you were trying to write everything Jesus said or did, I mean, you couldn't have enough books. Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff we didn't see. But you can see numerous times where He did not heal every single person that He would have walked by. So in general, that's kind of the ditches. And what we try to do is, I think we talk about it later, but I love what we talked about it before. Joby might have brought up the first time is that, or no, it was actually Chandler that brought it up the first time, is like a very healthy way to pray when you're praying for a healing is actually going way back to Daniel 3 with the guys in the fire, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He's like, what? And I reread it early this morning. It's like, our God is able. So I know God can. And they said, and we believe God's going to take us out of this. So I know God can, I believe God will, but even if not, I'm not going to bow to your idol. And I think I kind of tweaked it a little bit to say, even if he doesn't, I'm going to still walk with Jesus.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So, anyway, I'm learning a lot. And again, I was proud of our church.
Yeah. I think going back to Sunday and even in conversations since then, even if circumstances haven't changed, there's a difference in the countenance in the people who came forward of just what it does to your faith when you activate it like that. If you think about Jesus's miracles, he often realized that people had a spiritual issue, even if they had a physical issue. And so I see the faith pushing people forward to a place of joy, to a place of hope, whereas I don't know that they had it when they came in the room that day. They were struggling a little bit, but just that faith step, the action step that they took of coming forward, of getting prayer for what they're dealing with, was the reminder of who's in charge, who's in control, and who can redeem the situation, and took the pressure off of them too. Because if God's in charge, that means you're not. And so you can give this over to him. You can trust him through it, and you can let that propel you through the trial, the circumstance, the suffering.
Yeah. And that is one of the things you see almost, I don't know about in every miracle, but there is the theme of kind of that faith and hope. And it's not that they all had a bunch of faith. As a matter of fact, there's numerous examples. There's like just a little bit of faith. But I do a couple of the themes that they had faith, and usually that faith, even if it was a little bit, propelled them to some type of action. Like the guy in this story, he takes him at his word and he goes.
Right.
Other times the guy does like take up his mat, or the dad, even confessing, I do believe, help my unbelief. And so there's at least a little bit of the faith that they showed by what they did. And that is a theme you see, quite often in the miracles. Not that they have faith in faith. And again, let's be clear.
Right.
Faith in faith that's a doctrine, I think, from hell. That I have got to get. It's all about how much faith if I can get hallelujah faith and God's doing it. I think that starts to bleed into the prosperity gospel, which is actually really not the gospel.
Right.
That God is at my beck and call versus, God is a good dad. And he will, because we know he doesn't heal all the time. I mean, take like the Apostle Paul. I mean, you think he didn't have enough faith? Well, he pleaded 3 times, and then God told him I wasn't going to do it, and he even told him the reason he wasn't going to do it. He's like, listen, you're going to be the best church planner ever, and you're going to get too big for your britches. If you get this too, then there's no governor on your pride. Right. So, and we don't sometimes get that, which I don't know if that make it easier or harder if he told you why he wasn't going to heal you.
Yeah.
But anyway, again, going back, I know he can, and I believe he will. That's just about the goodness of God. But even if he doesn't, that's about the sovereignty of God, that God knows best. Ultimately, God knows best. But I know he can. I know he's able, and I'm actually believing that he will. And that's the hardest part, probably. I'm believing that he will, because when days turn into weeks, we talk about that old phrase. It's like we go from hoping to coping.
Right.
I'm going to cope with not having this answered, and how do you keep that alive? And how it's like, here's the promise today, and here's the answer tomorrow. Because ultimately, everybody's going to if you're in Jesus, you're going to get healed.
That's right.
The question is when.
Yeah.
I mean, that is what you've got to kind of keep in mind is the healing's going to come. And even if he heals you here, you're going to die again at some point unless Jesus comes back.
Yeah.
And so again, and wrapping the whole thing around when it comes to miracles, all of it. And I was reading, I'm rereading last week when I was off. I was rereading again, going back to the book of Acts and just rereading. And it struck me again about, because there's a bunch of miracles that were happening kind of in people, like, is Acts transitional? And if so, how much is it transitional? All this kind of stuff. But regardless, even though those things were happening and certain things, with Peter and those guys, they always went back to the resurrection. I mean, early on, they were going in their sermons. They would go back. It's like, hey, we're just men, or hey, don't worship us. Listen, you crucified a person, but God raised him from the dead. So they're always going back to the ultimate miracle, of the empty tomb. And if you have real trouble, you're just thinking philosophically. People that have trouble with miracles, because miracles are by definition, they don't happen all the time.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they'd be, I think it was C.S. Lewis would call them not miracles, he'd call them regulars.
Yeah.
And so a miracle or supernatural, I mean, think about like supernatural. Supernatural is where God does something outside of the natural laws that he has put into place. Something that you're like, all right, these are the laws he put into place, and this is the way the earth normally works.
Right.
Normally if your cancer is here, this person dies. And so there are times when he's like, I'm going to take the natural laws that I put into place and I'm going to do something there. And then we can talk here in a minute about why he might do that. We'll see it actually this week in John 9. But if you can get to Genesis 1:1 and you can get to an empty tomb, the rest of it is not hard to believe at all.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, if in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, you can get there. And if you can get to, hey, you killed a guy and God raised him from the dead, then the rest of it is kind of like cake. It's not that hard. And that's what the early disciples were doing over and over and over again. They were just linking it all back to the empty tomb.
Well, and that's one of the reasons why it's so great when people from our church come back from a mission trip, their eyes get open to the way God's working in the world. They kind of get out of that narrow kind of, oh, this is the only way that God does this thing.
Yeah.
When it comes to things like miracles, they come back and go, oh man, God's doing some incredible stuff on the other side of the world, just like he is here, but you kind of see that in a different context.
You see it in a different context because we get spoiled. I mean, the three of us are spoiled. All you got to do to realize how spoiled you are is go like to a church that's really struggling, seeing God do anything. And we've said it before on this podcast that we spend 20 minutes at the first of every staff meeting and we talk about stories of God at work. And some of them are like, well, I can explain that maybe, but most of them are like, how did that happen? I mean, and after about 30 of them, you're like, that's not a coincidence. That's providence. That's the providence of God, either bringing people together, solving this, all that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, the miracles are different, but I think a lot of it is like just seeing it. Like, not to get ahead, but this week, other people, including the disciples, they went by this blind guy. They just had already walked by him. And it says, and Jesus saw this guy. I think sometimes we just don't, we get busy. I've heard you talk about distractions before.
Yeah.
You get busy, you're on this, using your fake Bible on your phone. And we don't see people, and sometimes we miss what God's doing because we just are, we're going to the next thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, when you go overseas, you might see it in a different context. Because people, there's a little bit of more understanding of the need over there than here. I mean, you think about need, and our culture right now, there's not we have a lot of stuff, and that can really mask any sense of need. And so you never get to the poor in spirit. You never get to poor in spirit.
Right.
Well, I mean, you think about a passage like where you see Martha and Mary and the differences those two had. Sometimes that can apply to churches too, where you've got churches that are so busy with that kind of activity dust that you're talking about, they miss out on the presence of God, which is why we take our response culture so seriously. Is that's a time where, like that healing at the end of the service, or coming up forward to receive prayer, that's a Mary moment.
Yeah, and for a little bit of Baptist background, that little anointing with oil, that was a push. That was a little shove out the bird nest right there. So.
I like that expression.
Yeah, that was for everybody, but.
No, that's great. So I want to dig in with both of you guys. You mentioned kind of the difference between, hey, it's not about the amount of your faith, it's the object of your faith. But wanted to ask you both, what are some of the misconceptions that you've seen when it comes to faith and healing, faith and miracles, faith and God working, that people tend to grab onto?
I mean, I think you've already alluded to this, but it's just the idea that I've got to muster it up. And I've got to have the amount of faith that I need. And the more I need God, the more faith I must have. But it's just the reminder that God doesn't diminish himself. And so he is always God, which means everything he does is big because he can't do tiny things. Like everything he does has eternal significance. And so it's just the reminder of who you are trusting more than what you want. And so putting your emphasis on who he is and what he does, and then trusting him, knowing that, like you said, healing comes. It's just a matter of when it does. And putting your hope there. And that's not false hope. That's real. I think eternity is the most real thing that we get to experience as believers someday, and we get to put our hope there now, not just then.
Yeah, I mean, your hope is not in the miracle; it's in the miracle maker. I mean, that's the key thing. Actually, even in the story, you see him kind of give a slight rebuke to them looking for just the miracle. And even John doesn't even. I don't think John uses miracle in his. I don't think John. He always uses the word sign. or usually uses the word sign,
Yeah.
which is the idea there's something behind this.
Right.
And it's not just about the sign. It's like, I think I used a few weeks ago, it's like if you come into Asheville, you'll see a welcome to Asheville. Well, the sign itself is not Asheville.
Yeah, right.
It's just a picture. And in some ways, the miracles are the same way. It's like, this is a picture behind the purpose
Right.
of, why he came. And that's what, you see that starting with the water turned into wine, or grape juice, as people would like to be. Just those type of things. There's something behind it. And, what Michelle was saying is, the hope is not in the circumstances changing. If God, it's really pointing to your hope is in the character of God, that he's a good dad. And if he wants to bring your prodigal home, or if he wants to heal you from cancer or whatever, and if he doesn't, guess what? And that goes back to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's like, I'm trusting God because God's character. But let's be clear, though, there are ways to build your faith. Mm-hmm. There are ways God gave us the word to build our faith, community to build our faith, all those things. We do need to have fuel for our faith, because if all you do is sit there and it's like, I'm just waiting. And when I say waiting, I'm not talking about waiting like the Lord says to wait for the Lord. Because actually, if you look like, Psalm 27:13 says, I would have despaired if I did not believe I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. But then the very next verse says, wait for the Lord, wait for the Lord. And it's not like twiddling your thumbs. It's active. Right. I'm seeking the Lord. That's where really the faith comes in. Do I have enough faith to at least cry out to God?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
If you look at it, do I have enough faith to pray? Because faith is not no doubt. I think that's, to the question you were asking, what do people have a misconception? Right. Faith is not a lack of doubt. You see all the disciples. Probably the funniest one is like, if you look at Matthew, is it Matthew 28? Where like Jesus is ascending into heaven.
Oh yeah.
And there's a little phrase like, some believed and some doubted. You're like, how are you doubting? He's
right.
It's like David Copperfield.
Just happened.
How is that happening?
Yeah.
And then you see them throughout the times where they're having doubts. They're having so doubts is like you take your doubts and you bring them to the Lord.
Right.
I don't know if to be honest, nobody. All three of us have had doubts. Your doubts differ, I think, where you are in your walk. Mm-hmm. And so early on, your doubts might be, okay, how do I know the Bible's true? And those kind of, then you get those satisfied. And there's certain things, questions that you have. Mm-hmm. That's different than just a sense of almost what I think Keller called it, honest doubt and dishonest doubt. Mm-hmm. Honest doubt wants an answer.
Right.
Dishonest doubt is kind of a stubbornness. I don't care what evidence you show me.
Yeah.
I'm not believing.
Yeah.
And some Christians, believers can have some dishonest doubt as well. We can just get stubborn. We can get stuck in sin. Mm-hmm. It's like, I don't care, or at least for a period of time. I don't care, that stubborn. And that's when actually God disciplines us, when we get real stubborn too.
Mm-hmm. So I want to jump into something that you kind of mentioned briefly there, which is just asking the question, what role does prayer play when it comes to God doing miracles, God healing, God moving in a supernatural way?
Yeah, I'll just make a couple comments, and Michelle, please jump in. Yeah, there's mystery to this. Mm-hmm. When you talk about, because if we're being really honest, sometimes you pray and nothing happens that you see. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you don't pray, and what you kind of hoped would happen. You're like, all right, I didn't pray and it happened. And so you're like, where does that all go? But what you do see prayers, especially a lot of times in the word is used in the Psalms, it's more of a cry sometime. Mm-hmm. But prayer is definitely an expression of dependence and can be for desperation too. So like when you see these miracles and stuff, what you do see, like take this guy. This guy's like, he'd be somebody that lives in the suburbs. He's got a lot of stuff. He's got power, position, influence, affluence, all those kind of things. But all that stuff, none of that stuff was going to get his son better. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so there's the point of need that obviously the Lord knew. It's like, all right, this is the point of need. And there's a progression of belief here. And you'll see it in John 9 this week too. I didn't realize, I was doing a little study last week of John 9. There's a progression. Like this guy believes the word before he believes Jesus. You look at it, he's like, I believed the word and he went. So he's like, hey, we don't even know, they don't have enough detail. Yeah. But then it's later on, you can tell he actually believed in the Lord, he and his household. Right. In the same way, the blind guy, you're going to see that, okay, he believed enough to go to the pool and wash off the mud.
Yeah.
But then the next time they ask him, it's like, who is he? Like, I don't know, prophet. And then later on, he's like, do you believe in the Son of Man? He's like, well, tell me who he is. He's like, I'm the one standing in front of you. He's like, well, I believe then. And so there was a progression of going from belief in something to a belief in someone. And that's what you see. You do see that kind of often, but it did start off, you see that little bit of that thread going through here as well. I can't remember where I got off on a rabbit chase. What was your question?
Prayer. We're talking prayer.
So anyway,
all
I know is, the best prayers are almost more like a cry. That's about all I know. I mean, there's prayer you do when you don't have to tell when you're desperate. Nobody has to tell you. You don't have to have a sermon on prayer. I mean, if your boy's over in the Middle East fighting a war, nobody's having to pump you up to pray because you were just desperate. Please protect my son.
Yeah.
When your little girl is in Texas Children's Hospital with cancer. I mean, you're not having to go over there. Now those prayers aren't pretty sometimes. Sometimes they're mixed with anger. Sometimes they're mixed with a lot of stuff, but that sounds a lot like the Psalms.
Yeah, it does.
So again, how it exactly works, I mean, the old saying, God does move at the prayers of his people, for sure. And so there is something he tells us to pray, and he tells us to keep knocking, and a lot of the parables on prayer are about perseverance.
A lot of them.
And so while there is a mystery, the more you pray, they're just, people are like, oh, it's a coincidence. Well, the more you pray, those coincidences just seem to happen a lot more, which seems a lot more like providence.
Yeah.
I think for me, there's a couple of things. I think about when I pray, there's a difference in my joy. It reminds me of who God is and what he can do and what he's already done, more than what he might do. It is the reminder of what he has already done and how that is so much more than I deserve. And so it gets me grateful, which gives me the perspective that I need to be able to move forward in the trial. I also think when you talk about the stuff that you've got that intense desperation for, there's so many times that you don't have the words and that you don't even know how to pray yourself. And so you invite people in your life who love the Lord to pray with you and to pray for you. And so it just gives isolation like a swift kick in the pants to where, because that's where the devil likes to move. And so we don't give him a foothold there. And it just reminds you of, again, goes back to God's goodness of the fact that we have him. And then he gives us the gift of one another. And so don't pray by yourself.
Yeah. And that's a great part about your joy is restored. But cousin to that is also, that's where your peace is going to come from. I mean, that's the famous Philippians passage is like, do not be anxious. The word anxious there is like being torn apart. I think it's the same word with Martha. Which again, thank God for Martha's. And we're going to look at that in a few weeks. I mean, Martha gets a bad rap, but if all you had was Mary, nothing would get done. But the idea is, you could tell in her case, she was the same word as anxious. Over beyond. She is anxious. She is, but it says in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And then on the back end of that is, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding. So, I mean, it's like, once you give it to the Lord, you can't explain it, but there's a sense of like, I got this. Yeah. Not I got this, but God's like, I got this. And sometimes you can't explain that. And sometimes you got to jump back and do it again, and that anxiety starts to build. But there is that relief, and that's where the joy that Michelle talked about. When you're going through it, it's hard to have joy unless you have really honestly given this over to the Lord. And then sometimes you got to do it over and over again. And there are times when there's this sense and you cannot explain it. It's like, whether it be, he's just like, I got, just that sense of, all right, my Father's got this.
Right.
And you might not see anything visibly that gives you that. And if all you're looking for is, okay, when's that, I got to see something visible. Sometimes, that doesn't happen all. I mean, God doesn't usually move super quick. Sometimes he does, but sometimes it takes a little bit of time.
Yeah.
And then last point is prayer does something to you. Yes, it moves the hand of God. You see that in the scriptures. But what you definitely see is it does something to you, to your soul, and to your faith. So that's why there is still a mystery, but you see all those together.
Yeah.
And it's a small difference, but I think prayer is what makes waiting on God shift to waiting with God.
That's good.
And that reminder that we don't have to just wait by ourselves. For God to do something, we get to wait with him.
Say that again. It goes from waiting on God to waiting with God. Man, man, that will preach. No, you can't do
Solid.
it. But
You're like, that's mine now. I'll be using
it's
that.
like an obscure resource I read one day said.
Someone once said,
Someone once said,
Yes.
that's the
Man.
general domain.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. And I think, too, the people who you look at and you see their lives are just defined by prayer, that mask or that veil where people believe that they're self-sufficient has been ripped away from them one way or another. And that's what created in them that heart of prayer. Is they know either they had something that they knew they couldn't handle, like the story you were just talking about, or they realized that they really are not in control of anything and they need God's hand on everything in their lives.
Absolutely. I mean, it goes back. I mean, I think did you do the one with Crawford, or was that Sierra?
I think it was Sierra.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I mean, Crawford's book that I mentioned several times. I mean, that's his basic theme, and what you just said has been ripped away. But the Bible word for that is brokenness,
Right.
and just you get crushed. And when you get crushed, sometimes if the proper response to being crushed is surrender, not just a one-time thing, but a kind of a constant. I don't have the power to make one disciple, and let that reality. It's the John 15:5. Apart from me, you can do nothing.
That's right.
But that's the reality that you just don't have it memorized. That you have when you get crushed like that, it's like I don't ever want to go back to strutting,
That's right.
because that's like a bad place to be.
Yeah.
Because then you got to learn the lesson again.
Yeah, then you got to get
Oof.
I
crushed
don't want to
again.
get crushed again. It's like is that pride? It's like, okay, whatever it is,
Yeah.
you don't want to
Yeah.
be crushed again.
That's great. So a couple things I want to circle back around to. You mentioned it earlier. Big elephant in the room when we talk about healing, God moving, miracles, is what about when God doesn't heal? That's a question for a lot of people. I've been praying for this, or I've been waiting on this for years, or a family member who I was praying for their healing, it never happened. What do we do with that?
Right. No, good. I would say we've touched on it a little bit already. If they're in Christ, they're going to be healed.
That's right.
I mean, even take like a Lazarus in Luke 11. I mean, Lazarus, I mean, he doesn't just get healed, he gets resurrected, but every indication is Lazarus died some years later.
Right.
And so even if you get healed now, the ultimate healing is going to be with the Lord. So again, everybody in Christ does get healed. But the basic question would be, what about if I prayed and it goes and I prayed for Mama to get healed and she didn't, she died. I mean, those hurt. But again, I would say what you do is when you balance all the prayer out, because you can take one snippet on prayer, ask whatever you wish in my name and it will be given to you. Like if you just take that one and you can go to seed on that one, but when you take the holistic part of the way God moves, it is the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because that has the sovereignty of God and faith in a very healthy place.
Yeah.
And that is like, I know God is able. And you see that. You see Ephesians chapter 1, Ephesians chapter 3. I know God can do it. But I believe God will do it. And it does hurt though when God doesn't do it. But that is when you have to go back to the sovereignty and the goodness of God. Really, it's the goodness of God. Because you think about, I mean, we've all seen people who that exact scenario happens. God doesn't answer the prayer the way they thought God would answer their prayer, or whatever they thought God should do, God didn't do that. And that's, what is it? There's a Spurgeon that said that's like a foot poised. You're either going to, it's like you're going to take a step forward, or you're going to take a step backward. You're either going to take a step forward, or you're going to lean into the character of God, or you can take a step backward. And it's like, well, God, if you're not, if you're that kind of God, I'm not going to, whatever. If you're not going to heal my grandma, I'm certainly not going to serve you. And we see that a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, and so that's, and here's the part that is kind of crazy is oftentimes we see people do that, and then 5 years later, come back to the church or come back to a community. And what's amazing is they come back and they've spent 5 years in the wilderness trying to get their answer, because a lot of times if the Lord's not answering their answer the way they thought they should, they go the whole hog the other way. I'm going to go trash my life. I'm going to go do whatever I've been whatever I think will make me happy, I'll go do that. And then they come back 5 years later, and all they have scars. Because what they thought, God didn't do it, so I'm going to go to the world, and the world just trashes them.
Yeah.
And it's usually fun for like 4 months, and then the consequences and the soul issues never get solved, and then they come back 5 years. I love the fact our church really is good at receiving those people back.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of "I told you so's."
Yeah.
I told you if you just if you did that, I told you that's stupid.
Yeah.
Like, well, you know what? We've all done stupid stuff, and just showing some grace as people come back and loving them back because they know it.
Yeah.
They know it's like, okay. And but it comes back to, is God a good God? And that's why even Garden of Eden, God's holding out on you. I mean, that was like the number one little temptation. God doesn't want you to eat that because, you'll know good and evil. You'll be just like him. In other words, God's holding out on you. And that is the root of so much of the temptation. God's holding out on you. If you just had a better spouse, if you just had a better job, if you just had a better church, if you just had a better, whatever. And, no, that's the land of, what is it? Who is it told me? It's like, it's the temptation of there. If I just can get there, then it'll all be good. Well, there is usually right where you are. Right. It's just a place where you try to make flourish. But yeah, I'm going back to the goodness of God. If we can get over the fact God's a good God. Yeah. And even if I don't understand it, God's a good God and God loves me. And that's why we go back to the gospel. Don't judge God's goodness or his love or anything else based on how the calendar's going this week. Right. I mean, you judge it on how the calendar went 2,000 years ago and then go from there. So that's what I would say.
I love how you always talk about how the same gospel that saves you is the gospel that sustains you. And so how it applies in this situation is reminding yourself, the book of James tells us that this life is like a vapor, but eternity is forever. And so if you can trust God for your eternity, then you can trust him for your right now. And like that gives immense perspective to what we're going through this side of heaven.
Yeah.
I mean, and sometimes he does answer. There's occasionally times where, we get the why. Why is this happening? Sometimes he pulls back the veil. But I mean, think about it. Job, we think about all the stuff that happened to Job. Right. And we have more information than Job had. I mean, we kind of get to look at it from this point of view. Job didn't get any of that stuff. Yeah. I mean, Job just like, what is going, he didn't know any of the discussion. He didn't know any of that stuff. He's just getting crushed. He's getting crushed. And then gets crushed by his wife, then gets crushed by his friends or so-called friends, all that kind of stuff. But sometimes you get the why. I mean, there are some why answers in here, but most of the time, like even again, going into John 9, it's they want to put it in a category. I mean, even the disciples did. It's like, hey, who sent this guy or his parents? In other words, it was what you and I would kind of call karma, or what culture would call karma. Right. Which, if you're a Christian, there's no such thing as karma. All right. Karma based, and we want karma anyway, because karma means you get what you deserve. Yeah. And
that ain't good.
That ain't good. You don't want what you deserve. No. But that's kind of what. I mean, that's what they were thinking. I mean, what kind of karma did this guy do it, or because tradition says the guy's like 30, or did his parents do something that now he's getting it on? Which, and he's like, no, neither this guy nor his parents. This is so that the works of God and that God would be glorified. Right. So I mean, ultimately, you want to ask. You can ask the why. You can. God doesn't always answer that, but you can ask what. What should I do? Well, like when we get into the book of James in the fall. I mean, what is a good question? How is a good question? Yes. How do you want me to respond? What do you want me to do? How can I show glory in this? And the whole thing is like when God Abrahams you and gives you a bunch of blessing, then show the world, man, I can still love Jesus in a crazy way in spite of all this blessing. And when God Jobs you want to show that I can still trust God even when the rug gets pulled out from under me. Right. And everybody's going to have both of those seasons at some point. But if you're the Christian, that's sort of the North Star. How does God get glory for this? Does he get glory when I'm in the hospital at the cancer center? Or does he get glory when all of a sudden he chooses to heal me? And either way, that's the question you want to ask.
Well, that is a great place to maybe put a pin in our conversation today. Great way to wrap that up. A lot of helpful wisdom, biblical truth in there. This has been a great season. Great season in our church. Great literal season of our podcast, Very grateful for both of you being on here. Pastor, thank you for giving your time every week to having these conversations.
You got it.
I know it's just one more thing, but it's very helpful.
It's good. We're just going to get you an Astro hat.
I don't know if I wear that.
I don't know about this year. This year, maybe not.
So thank you both. And we're going to be taking a quick break here on the podcast, but that does not mean we're breaking on what God's doing in our church. Right. We're back this Sunday, continuing our series. I think it's week 9 of our One at a Time series already this weekend.
I know it's John 9. I'm not sure.
John 9, week 9. We're going to go with that. It matches up well.
Like
there you go.
Yeah, there you go. But thank you both. Thanks to everyone listening, watching. Hopefully this is encouraging for you.